what distinguishes humans from all other animals is that only humans are picture-making creatures. Only humans have a desire and a capacity to recognize themselves in a mirror, to create pictures, to write, to speak, to represent themselves in the world. No other animal has that capacity. And that belief has essentially continued to be true. There's like 1 or 2, maybe 3 species who can even recognize itself in the mirror other than humans. But that, for Douglass, highlights the fact that all humans are equal in their humanity. All humans deserve, have a foundational right. It goes to human rights, have a fundamental right to engage, to indulge in the power of imagination that cultivates this power of representation, this picture-making process. Douglass had great faith in the power of the camera as a weapon for ending slavery and fighting racism and trying to achieve human rights. And the events over the past 2 weeks, there would have been no protests had there been no cameras. He was accurate, it remains accurate in recognizing the power of the camera. He took advantage of the technology, of the new technology, particularly visual technology of his day, and the way that activists today, whether it's Black Lives Matter or other organizations, take advantage of the new media of our day. Douglass also recognized then, in a way that most people, I think, do today, that people, at least in the United States, they have faith in the truth value of the camera. Even then, photographers could manipulate the camera. They could airbrush out unwanted subjects, they could solarize, they could make double exposures. But people believed that the camera, when it photographed a subject, was a truthful portrait. And most of us still believe that the camera is truthful, even though in theory we know it's not. A lot depends on context. And so in that aspect of Douglass's understanding of photography, that still resonates. Had there been images of the victims in Baton Rouge or in Minnesota that were hand drawings, there wouldn't have been nearly as much, it wouldn't have had nearly as much effect. Had there been writing, there would have been some, but not as much as a photograph. I think he captured, he recognized the power that the camera had, that a photograph had in his day, of being able to send a truthful message that whoever that camera photographed was an equal human and deserved the equal rights of any human.
And you do, I think, I totally agree with that. You see Douglass in some of these photographs that we're scrolling through, you see him almost visually saying Black Lives Matter in the 19th century. I mean, he's clenching his fists at a time where photographers would not advise their subjects necessarily to do that. He's making direct eye contact, especially in the early photographs before the Civil War, when photographers would actually encourage subjects to stare off to the side, to look thoughtful. This is a confrontational gaze and a confrontational stance that Douglass has. And he also, he disseminated these images. And we found numerous engravings. Millions of people saw Douglass in the 19th century. He was visually famous. He was the most photographed American, and he made sure people saw his face. And I think of that a lot when I think about the success of Black Lives Matter in using imagery and using social media. Douglass fought probably the first great visual battle in American history. And there's another great visual battle happening today. Every time somebody is killed by the police, the photographs that people try and release, I think, are very different to then the photographs that families release. There's a clash, I think, of people being depicted as sort of stereotypical thugs in these official photographs that people try and circulate, versus actual images of people like Trayvon Martin, very different to the ones people want us to see. I think of Douglass, trying really hard to present really the first black public persona in American history. trying to reinvent what at that time black masculinity could really look like. So I think he speaks very clearly to the Black Lives Matter movement, and I've seen his name and his image at Black Lives Matter protests. There's a Black Lives Matter chapter in my city in Nottingham in England, and on July 5th the chapter met and read his 4th of July speech aloud in England. So he's very present, I think, in Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, I would second what Zoe and John are saying about the power of images. And of course they have produced a book that shows the various images of Douglass and the legacy of those images and how current day protesters imagine them. And it's wonderful to see protests in the streets of London and other places. In a way, what I looked at was the abolition movement as a whole that Douglass belonged to, and that was composed of African Americans and whites. And that I argue in my book that African Americans were really at the center of that movement, that it was not some kind of middle class liberal ideology coming out from northern whites, but slave resistance, fugitive slaves, former slaves writing their memoirs, representing themselves in images was central to the movement. And what's so important about the fact that we have this huge complicated archive, historical archive of black images, of black words, it was so important to counteract the kind of racist caricatures of black people that was dominant in the 19th century. So you can see what John was talking about earlier about the truth value, the protest content of these images, creating this kind of counter image to racist rhetoric and to racist images that was ubiquitous in the penny press, in broadsides. People were lampooned, were misrepresented. So Douglass, others, many other African Americans like him, James W.C. Pennington, Sojourner Truth, who famously said, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." She took images of herself as she lectured. That this was something that all abolitionists, and particularly African American abolitionists, had to do, had to represent themselves in very different ways than the ways in which they were caricatured in mainstream culture at that time.
Do I remember that Douglass said something like the human beings are the only animals who move to represent themselves?
Humans are the only picture-making creatures. So that was another reason why he had such faith in the camera. He borrows from a long line of philosophers from Aristotle through Emerson and Carlyle and say that so he's taking on all of these scientists. Louis Agassiz, who was our homegrown Boston, one of the most famous scientists, biologists in the United States. A building is still named after him at Harvard, and Louis Agassiz was representative of ethnologists, people interested in humans and animals. Louis Agassiz believed that he disseminated this idea in polygenism, that blacks were a separate species. They were that far inferior, but almost every white ethnologist argued that blacks were essentially subhuman. And they collected skulls and they did other work to try to measure the differences between humans and blacks and other animals. And Douglass just exploded that whole methodology by saying, from this long tradition, what distinguishes humans from all other animals is that only humans are picture-making creatures. Only humans have a desire and a capacity to recognize themselves in a mirror, to create pictures, to write, to speak, to represent themselves in the world. No other animal has that capacity. And that belief has essentially continued to be true. There's like 1 or 2, maybe 3 species who can even recognize itself in the mirror other than humans. But that, for Douglass, highlights the fact that all humans are equal in their humanity. All humans have a foundational right. It goes to human rights, have a fundamental right to engage, to indulge in the power of imagination that cultivates this power of representation, this picture-making process.
And so he wrote about this actually in these 4 really long speeches that were also essays. He was writing them during the Civil War. He actually wrote more about photography than any other 19th century intellectual. So we sort of transcribed and published those essays alongside the 170 now photographs that we've found of Douglass, and many of which are in this exhibit.
And I'm really glad that John raised the question of scientific racism, because not only did they have to counteract, popular caricatures, racist caricatures in the press, in popular culture, but at the intellectual level. I mean, Agassiz was the president of Harvard, and he is making these outrageous claims that one black abolitionist, one of my favorites, called the orangutan philosophy, and he basically dismissed it as having no scientific basis. And so many African American abolitionists, including Douglass, not only tried to represent themselves, but they took on these scientific races intellectually. They wrote books, pamphlets, made speeches, taking them on. And of course, now, from our perspective, in the 21st century, not only do we know that they had the better ideas about humanity and human rights, etc., they also had the better science than those scientific races of the 19th century, and it's important to remember that too.
Let me ask you to go back to the image for a minute. So I'm understanding that Douglass just disappeared as a figure for a while. And I'm wondering what made you start to think I should find images of him, and what was it that began to bring him back to the national stage in any event? So is that right?
So the disappearance, I think you're absolutely right. I think black history was very neglected, especially by white museums and universities. Yeah, up until the 1960s, really. And so, it was this instinct we had about 5 or 6 years ago that there were photographs of Douglass that people would use over and over again in books, maybe about a dozen, but that we knew because he'd written so much about photography, not just in his essays, but as editorials in his newspapers, we knew that there were probably more. And so John sort of set us a challenge of beating Lincoln and Walt Whitman, and then eventually General Custer. He was the tough one to beat. He had 155 photographs, unfortunately. Lincoln just 130, and Walt Whitman only about 130. So it was a great moment when we hit 156 of Frederick Douglass after 5 years of looking for these photographs. But I suppose in a sense, if there are now 170 of Douglass that we've found, we know there are many, many more that have been lost. Sometimes we find traces of them, sometimes it's an engraving or a copy print of a lost daguerreotype. But that neglect of Douglass and neglect of black history generally throughout the 20th century, except in the African American press.
Right.
So we found clues about images that we needed to look for from seeing them reprinted, in the Chicago Defender, in the Baltimore Afro-American. Right. So that was a real source. And then in murals too. You've seen some of the murals up here. There are 125 Frederick Douglass murals all around the world, but mostly in the US. And they date back to the 1920s and 1930s. So sometimes we would see a representation of Douglass in a mural that might now have been painted over or destroyed, but we have a photo of it, and realize it was based on a photograph, and then go in search of trying to find where that photograph ended up. So there were clues, but there were clues that we were getting from African American artists and newspapers, but not from collectors necessarily in the early part of the 20th century.
I would ask John, let you answer that question too. What did you just discover that made you say, wow? I mean, what was a big surprise for you?
There have been a lot of big surprises. In terms of individual images, there's some wonderfully touching ones. Ironically, the ones that are not representative. Douglass, as Zoe has said, is the main function of photography was had a public function. There are very few. Douglass was not invested in photography in the way that most people are, as a private memento, photographs of family and close friends that you keep publicly. He wanted disseminated. He dressed up in every photograph. He was immensely disciplined. He was what we call a part of a pas de trois between the camera and the photographer and himself creating this work of art. And the whole purpose, in the same way as the purpose in his speeches, and he was one of the greatest orators at a time in which public speaking was one of the only form of entertainment in the United States. It was his way of out-citizening white citizens, demanding equal participation in the United States and in the public sphere. That said, so we've discovered after the book came out, it's upstairs, a photograph of Douglass with his youngest daughter, Annie, who dies in 1860 at a young age. He was emotionally closest to her. And you see him, it's a copy print, I think, of a daguerreotype. The print itself, I went down to Baton Rouge to obtain a high resolution image. The print is in horrible condition, unfortunately. But you see him slumping down as a way to elevate Annie so she appears more dignified. She appears as an equal, even though she's 6 years old. That, to see that, it's the only known photograph of Douglass with any of his 5 children.
Yeah, so that was a big moment, I think,
That's
to
a huge
see
moment.
Douglass the father, and to realize that we'd never actually seen Douglass the father. You know, they're none with his other 3 children. We thought there were no photographs of Annie at all because she died so young.
I'll just say one other, and then you can. So, one of the points we make in the book is that Douglass, he conceptualized himself and the self in general as a self that continually evolves, is never static, is never fixed. And that explodes the very understanding of racism and of slavery, because slavery is predicated on a very low ceiling. It's based on fixity. And racism, among other things, depends upon the premise that one group of people is permanently superior to another group of people. Both are based on the idea of fixity. So he continually evolves. Who he is in 1841 is very different from who he is in 1850 and 1860 and so on. And you see that in his experimentation with facial hair. He's one of the great, fashion icons in the sense of his day. So there's one photograph, I couldn't believe it, is Frederick Douglass with a walrus mustache and a ponytail. And we would have had it as one of our central images, but we found it because it had been sold at a gallery. And the gallery wouldn't tell us who the buyer was, so we couldn't obtain a high resolution image. So we didn't have the big file, so we couldn't make a big image.
It just gives you a sense of this sort of treasure hunt that we were on, where we had these very dorky moments where this is the only known photograph of Douglass with a ponytail. This was like a really exciting moment for us.
We're thrilled to have a photograph of Douglass with his daughter.
Yes.
It's not in your book, but
No, it's not. So actually a world premiere, I don't think people have seen this photograph. We had never seen it. It isn't in our book because the book, I think, went to press, 3 weeks or something before this photograph emerged. So I think we're exhibiting it here for the first time in the museum, and that's quite an exciting thing.
And I think the problem also has been that it's not just been Douglass, but the whole slew of African American abolitionists, men and women, were sort of written out of history.
That's right.
And the period that you talk about, that turn of the century, early 20th century, that's the nadir in Black history. This is the time for segregation, racial pogroms, lynching, etc. And Black people are either erased from American history or they're portrayed in caricatured ways. And abolitionists in particular, Black and white, are portrayed as these crazy fanatics who caused the war, caused the Civil War, a needless war. And the whole idea was to completely discredit the abolitionist project, which was not just to end slavery, but to establish Black citizenship. That's what Douglass was all about. His vision of an interracial democracy in this country based on Black citizenship, that's something that we are seeing and still struggling for even today, because we still see the legacy of slavery in terms of fugitivity. The fugitive slave, the criminalized Black person versus claims of citizenship. For me, the most remarkable moment was a few years ago when the University of Heidelberg in Germany decided to endow a fellowship named after James W.C. Pennington, who is one of the forgotten Black abolitionists, really, who not only wrote against scientific racism, also had his portrait done, toured England like Douglass, giving speeches against slavery. Well, that was
Or
Germain
he
Lagoon.
brought them together.
Yeah, he married Douglas and Anna Marie Douglas. He was the priest, the reverend, the minister who officiated at Douglas's and Anna Marie Douglas's wedding in New York City. So here's this man. He is finally recognized with a scholarship from the University of Heidelberg in 2011 because he's the first African American to receive a PhD in divinity, an honorary doctorate from the University of Heidelberg, and they wanted to honor him. And President Obama sent a message, commemorating that. And it just shows us that many of these issues that these abolitionists fought for and that were denigrated at that time have sort of come back to us, and that today we can recall them in far more positive ways.
And it's interesting when people just disappear from history. Time Magazine just did a piece on your book. And I think the headline was, "What is it about the abolitionists we don't know?"
Yeah.
And what they didn't know is that black people self-emancipated. It was that simple. So this, the disappearance of image, it seems to me, is connected with something more serious. There was a disappearance of people and their agency.
Absolutely. I think with that timepiece, especially, I sort of ended it with saying, yes, of course, you need to look at Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation and the Union Army and the laws being passed by Congress. But emancipation was not just handed down to black people. There are generations that had struggled for freedom, and those who had voted with their feet for freedom before even Lincoln decided to move on emancipation. So I ended that article by saying that black people were, in a way, architects of their own liberation. And that is something that we really do need to remember today.
And the first, as you point out, to reconceptualize the United States as not a white man's democracy, but a thoroughly interracial democracy with men and women. It's no coincidence that women's rights was an outgrowth of the abolition movement. And that's something that we're still fighting today, frankly.
I think of Frederick Douglass as a passionate feminist for his time. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, he devoted a lot more speeches to focused on slavery and racism, but his proudest accomplishment, he said it more than once, was the work that he did on behalf of women. And he went out of his way to champion women's rights. He attended the first Women's Rights Convention in world history at Seneca Falls in 1848. He was one of the few men there. In the debate on whether the people there advocated for a suffrage, initially the debate, a number of women felt that was too revolutionary. Douglass stood up and gave an eloquent speech arguing fervently for the importance of universal suffrage, and it carried in part because of his speech. And that's one of numerous instances of Douglass fighting for universal rights. He fought on behalf of Asians after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. I mean, he very much envisioned the United States as a pluralist democratic nation, not just white and black, not just male. In fact, he said more than once that he had no patriotism to the United States. His patriotism was to humanity. His patriotism was to humanity, not the United States. He wanted the United States to live up to humanity.
And I think that's so important to think about Douglass as fighting for human rights. I mean, the motto of his paper is, "Right is of no sex and truth is of no color." That was the motto of Frederick Douglass's paper. And like Garrison, Douglass was a staunch supporter of women's rights, and there was a point during the Civil War and immediately afterwards when there was a division between those who emphasized women's right to vote and those who were very keen to pass the 14th and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution that would guarantee black men the right to vote. And many white feminists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were outraged that black men should get the right to vote before them. And as I write in my book, at that point when that split takes place between the abolitionists and feminists, you know, some things were gained, but a lot was lost. And that was the abolitionist commitment to racial equality. And you have this division within the white women's movement, and with the suffrage movement becoming more of a white middle class feminist movement. So I think there's something important to think about the universalism of abolition and the ways in which they included a lot of disfranchised people. That even while fighting the slaves' cause, they included so many other causes, whether it was women, immigrants, working people. They attempted to include all those disfranchised sections of the nation in their cause, Native Americans.
So do you think of abolitionism as the first human rights movement?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it fascinated me. This was my aha moment, I guess. The equivalent maybe to Douglass, the picture of Douglass with his daughter. They had a journal, and I think actually, and I would wager, this claim, they had the first journal that was called Human Rights. This is long before the mid-20th century when the United Nations is born and we really get our modern conception of human rights. I mean, they actually had a journal in the 1830s that was entitled Human Rights. So they did have, I would argue, an incipient conception of human rights that went beyond natural rights philosophy from the revolutionary era.
And you see that as well in the Black Lives Matter movement, just to return to that, that it's surely a new civil rights movement, but the manifestos and the values also describe a human rights movement. When the United Nations visited the US in January, the working group of experts on people of African descent, they described Black Lives Matter as a human rights movement, and they described the situation in the US during their month-long visit when they looked at a lot of different things and met with a lot of different people as a nation with a human rights crisis, with the human rights violation. And the UN has a big report coming out in September about that. So it's really fascinating to think about if Black Lives Matter is an international human rights movement, if perhaps its origins are in abolitionism as a similar thing.
I would completely agree. I mean, there were black abolitionists like David Ruggles, who would confront slave catchers and slave hunters on the streets of New York, or Charles Langston, who is the sort of step ancestor of Langston Hughes, black abolitionists from Ohio. They said self-preservation, self-defense is the first law of nature. And that's the 19th century way of saying Black Lives Matter.
I was going to ask you to place, Douglass in the trajectory of black activism. And I know that you have taken that up in your book, as you look at some of the same culture that moves through the abolitionist movement, through the civil rights movement, and we talked today about into the Black Lives movement. Is there more you can say about that?
Yes, definitely. In a way, I would go back to what John said about how the history of abolitionism was really not taken up until the 1960s, the civil rights movement, when people started talking about the new abolition movement, the second reconstruction of American democracy, actually implementing those constitutional amendments and laws that had guaranteed black rights in the 1860s. Even today, there are cases being fought based on the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution or the 1866 Civil Rights Act. Not the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but the 1866 one. And I think most civil rights activists were aware of this. And a lot of them are the ones who started rewriting the history of abolition, of radical social movements in this country, because they wanted to look back for historical precedents, and they found Douglass, and they found the black and white abolitionists, men and women, who had fought for equal rights. And it's interesting how much they used those ideas. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s quotation that everyone says now about the arc of the moral universe being long, but it bends towards justice, is from a local black a local Boston abolitionist, a Unitarian minister, Reverend Theodore Parker, who was also involved in fugitive slave rescues. So they were aware of those connections, I think, and there is a real legacy of what I would call the long struggle for Black equality in this country that most civil rights activists, and as Zoe mentioned, Black Lives Matters, people are sort of aware of. And just to end very quickly, I loved it when I was finishing writing this book. After the horrible massacre in Charleston, President Obama went and sang Amazing Grace. And it struck me that here is our first Black president singing an abolitionist hymn written by a repentant slave trader in a church founded by Black abolitionists. So it's definitely relevant for us.
So just to add really quickly, I think we also shouldn't forget the anti-lynching movement, in that narrative we're describing, from abolition through to civil rights through to Black Lives Matter. This is a 70-year-long movement from the 1870s through to the 1940s that Douglass helped to originate. He was not just a leading abolitionist, he was the first great anti-lynching activist too. And I think Black Lives Matter activists also look back very resonantly to the anti-lynching movement that itself, after Douglass's death, picked up that baton and remembered Douglass repeatedly and had their own war of imagery. People like Du Bois publishing images of dignity and self-possession, very resonant of the Douglass photographs in his magazine, The Crisis, against those circulating photographs of lynched bodies. So another visual sort of battle that, for me, always echoes the battle that Douglass was engaged in.
And I would just say that these various movements, from Black Lives Matter to the civil rights to anti-lynching back to Douglass, all recognized the power of the camera or photography. It's really it's in the wake of the rise of Black Lives Matters that African Americans increasingly won't leave home without a camera. That happened, it's no coincidence that it coincides with the rise of Black Lives Matter. One anecdote that captures the power of photography for the civil rights movement: Charles Moore, who was a white Southern photojournalist covering SNCC when King and his activists were marching and speaking through the South, had covered them as a photojournalist for several years and became a complete convert and asked for a private interview with Martin Luther King Jr. King granted it, and Charles Moore, this photojournalist, met with King and said, I'm going to quit my job as a photojournalist. I want to join your movement. What can I do to help? And King responded, the best thing you can do is just keep photographing us the way you have been, sympathetically, to send the message to the world that we have rights. And so King recognized the power of those now iconic photographs as a crucial aid in the movement. One of the things that Douglass and other African activists in the anti-lynching campaign did was to reappropriate the lynching photographs taken by whites that circulated in the South as a warning to blacks. They reappropriated that iconography as part of their anti-lynching campaign, and that's been a common usage among imagery in activists. You reappropriate an icon or an image if you feel that it has power. And then Douglass, of course, was the kind of foundational figure in that. So there's an intimate connection between these civil rights movements and the camera.
Yes, Anna is the only child that Douglass took a photograph with, who is the young man with the violin. And can you talk about what that means?
So, I can take the last one then. So that was Joseph Douglass, Douglass's grandson. And that's actually, Zoe and I argue, it's less a private memento than a public image, because Joseph Douglass was a concert violinist. And Douglass gave a speech, and Joseph Douglass performed on his violin, and after the event, they had their portrait taken together. So it should really be seen more as affiliated with this public event, a public image, rather than the private image.
And he felt a real, I think, affiliation with Joseph professionally and artistically. And so they did this little tour. Actually, they came to Boston, and there's, I think, 3 or 4 photographs of them together in Boston. But in each one, Douglass is holding a paper that's maybe related to the lecture he was giving, and Joseph's holding the violin. So it's we do think of it as more professional.
Fellow artists.
So really it is just the Annie photograph, that's an actual family portrait, I think.
Well, I'll address a question about the abolitionist legacy after President Obama's term is over. I have to confess that I feel like that little girl whose video went viral on social media. She was told that President Obama won't be president anymore, and she started crying. That's how I feel when I think of him leaving office. But I do think that the abolitionist legacy will live on, and it has now become wrapped up, I think, a little bit also in Barack Obama's legacy for this country. I don't think that just because he would cease being president, his legacy would be forgotten, or that it wouldn't have a long-term permanent impact. And I think he said it best at the Iowa caucuses, after the 2008, his first primary win, caucus win in Iowa in 2008 in the presidential primaries. He said, "Who would think that I would win this primary?" It's like those band of abolitionist men and women. And the moment he said that, my ears perked up, because I've been writing this book for 10 years. And he said, it's like those band of abolitionist men and women who just took on slavery, and they succeeded. So yes, we can. And so I do think that his election represents a moment in American democracy that is very important. And I know he has his critics and his admirers, but I don't think even people who criticize him can belittle the importance of him having become president. So this is one of my favorite anecdotes in the book, because William Lloyd Garrison, we are right here at the Meeting House, Garrison's Liberator, published here, very much situated in the black community in Boston, inspired by black radicalism. In fact, people thought that Garrison was black before they actually met him. Lord Buxton, when he met him in England, he said, "I thought you were a black man." And Garrison said, "I'll take that as the highest compliment of my work." But somebody asked Garrison, a racist critic asked him, he said, "Can you imagine ever voting for a black man as president of the United States?" And Garrison said, "Yes, of course I can. I can imagine." And probably he was thinking of Douglass, because he had met Douglass, and he had met his match in Douglass, who of course ended up being his own person with his own views about American democracy, the nature of the US Constitution, etc. And he, broke away from Garrison on many of those political issues. So I think the abolitionist legacy for American democracy is ongoing. And most reflective African American leaders are aware of that. I mean, to me it was amazing also that when Deval Patrick became the first black governor of Massachusetts, he asked to be sworn on the Bible presented by Cinque from the Amistad Rebellion to John Quincy Adams, who had defended the Amistad rebels in the Supreme Court. So this history, this American history of fighting for rights, of perfecting American democracy, I think will live on. And I think Obama's presidency has been a very important moment in that. I don't think many people realize that now, but they will.
You'll see it too in a very concrete way as well, in how he's dealt with contemporary slavery and human trafficking. I mean, he gave in 2013 the longest speech about slavery than any president since Lincoln, and it was about the 46 million people who are enslaved around the world. It was the closest we've come to a sort of second Emancipation Proclamation. It was an executive order about forced labor and human trafficking in, I think, federal contracts overseas. And he did that at the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And really until President Obama, I think the US and the State Department were comfortable talking about slavery-like practices and definitely human trafficking as a word. And the first thing that happened, the first report about slavery under the Obama administration, they went right in on naming this practice, this global practice, on what it is, which is slavery, people forced to work for no pay against their will. So he's been quite pivotal in that fight. And interestingly, Frederick Douglass's great-great-great-grandson, Kenneth B. Morris Jr., who wrote the afterword to our book, heads up an initiative about contemporary slavery called the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. So putting Douglass's name and putting the family's work into contemporary slavery. So the question was about Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. I think that key abolitionist lesson that actually, legal slavery might have sort of ended, but the spirit of slavery very much lived on, and Douglass made this point himself, and so did other abolitionists. I see that at work in President Obama's efforts with this new illegal, but very much still present form of slavery.
I can take the question on speaking, writing, and pictures and connect it to what Manisha and Zoe said. Douglass was widely considered one of, if not the greatest public speakers in the United States. He commanded a higher speaking fee than virtually any other public orator. And Douglass, when he gave a speech, he would sell his photographs. He would sell his books. He saw public speaking. He's also one of the greatest autobiographers in the United States. He transforms the genre of autobiography. He literally transforms it with his 3 slave narratives. And so he sold his autobiographies. He sold other pamphlets of his speeches. At the same time, he sold his photographs. He saw them working together. The photograph offered a certain power, immediate power that you couldn't obtain in the speech. The speech was still a public spectacle, and public speaking was one of the only forms of public entertainment. So the typical speech was 2 hours. People would travel for miles around. There were times when Douglass would speak before 5,000 people, 10,000 people. He was blessed with a rich, deep baritone voice. It was musical. He was immensely handsome. He was an actor. And his voice carried in the age before microphones, so that was helpful. But the power of his oratory, or at least the written version of it, has continued. Obama cut his eye teeth on Frederick Douglass. In Audacity of Hope, he quotes Douglass saying that without power will concede nothing without a fight. It's Douglass's 1857 British West Indian Emancipation speech. Douglass also establishes a framework for African Americans to pose in a dignified way, to present themselves as citizens. It's no coincidence, we think, that Obama's presidential photograph is not as a widely smiling president, which is a long tradition.
He's the first president since Nixon to not have his official presidential portrait be smiling.
Yes.
And if you take Nixon out of it, he's the first one since Eisenhower. So this Douglass talked a lot about African American leaders not smiling. Douglass smiles less often in photographs than anybody else in the 19th century, less often than Lincoln or John Brown, than Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It's very important to him not to smile, and you see that, I think, played out again in some of President Obama's official portraits.
Right.
So thank you. You've given us a lot to think about.
More so than any other abolitionist, any other American, it was Douglass who understood the implications of his country's love affair, its fascination with this new technology.